Who is using NX right now to develop their app, their Angular app, push it in production? Awesome. Who uses NX outside of Angular? We're at an Angular conf, so it's fine. So for those not knowing what NX is an open source development tool. I often refer to it as a development productivity tool because we are known for monorepos, but now recently you can also have just single project workspace. So basically what the Angular CLI is generating for you as well. And we invest a lot of time and techniques. It's basically our core business to make sure the tool is good and makes your life easier. And we're going to have a look a bit today also on those standalone projects. So just a little bit of storyline, because I think it's important to understand where NX came from and why some of the things that you might see are so similar also to what Angular CLI does. And so the two founders of NX, Victor Safkin and Jeff Cross, they have been part of the Angular team. So they were, when there was still Angular 1.x, and they helped the whole rewrite and transition to Angular 2+. Jeff Cross was actually the lead of the famous Angular mobile team, and Victor Safkin is the one that wrote the router which we're using today. At least probably parts probably have been rewritten, but he was the one that published the third version of the router after 3 rewrites, which then luckily sticked with Angular. And so at around when Angular 2 was launched, a couple months or half year after, I think, they left Google and they've created Narwhal, which is basically an Angular consultancy. Because they saw obviously that big gap of like now people wanting to go to Angular 2, like to the new rewritten version, and needed a lot of support in migrating to those new Angular technologies, but also in terms of like consulting in general and teaching and content. And so while working with those companies, they also started on the side an open source project, which was NX, to help create monorepo specifically, because they knew the monorepo inside Google, they kind of loved working with it, but they saw that lack of like a simple monorepo tool that is sustainable and someone can easily spin up and go with it. And so that's how NX was born, I think almost 5 years ago, 6 years. And NX is basically because it's called Narwhal Extensions for Angular. The reason is, actually initially, this was how you create a new NX workspace. It was just an Angular CLI schematic, right? So that's how you create a workspace with the Angular CLI. It was slightly tuned, so you had like an absent libs instead of a source folder, and some more things that came with this extension. But it was just an Angular schematic. So this is roughly, like not one-to-one, right? But like this is roughly how it looked like. So you have your Angular application on top, you had like NX as a tooling, you had the Angular CLI, and then below there's the Angular dev kit, which provides all the builders and like generators and what we all know. Now, over the years, this changed a bit. So NX became its own CLI, like a fully capable CLI, and there's no dependency for Angular CLI anymore. Like, so we don't really need the Angular CLI to be below it, but we still use definitely the Angular dev kit. So we still just use the Angular builders that Angular team provides, the generators that come with it. But we also added another dev kit, basically, which is an NX dev kit, which is specifically for NX and provides some more utilities more specifically. So this is roughly how it looks like. And the main reason why it became independent from the Angular CLI is because we, at NX, transitioned out of the Angular community as well. So we saw the Angular CLI concepts, like the concept of generators, a builder, they're actually useful outside as well, right? And so we expanded into a whole ecosystem, and so nowadays we have support for Angular, React, Vue, and a variety of other tools as well, even backend, JavaScript-based backends, so Node.js-based backends, but also .NET and Java-based backends. So there's some cool community plugins that expand NX even there. And so at a high level, this is what NX looks nowadays in terms of high-level architecture. So you have basically at the bottom, you have just NX itself, and you can use it as that, right? You don't need to have any plugins and everything. You can use it on an NPM workspace monorepo just for running tasks in parallel, quicker with caching that support. And then you have the plugins that you can see here up there, which you use for getting in a similar experience that the Angular CLI gives you, right? So with like the generators and all that stuff that you might want to have, which provides you better DX overall. And we have really grown tremendously in the last couple of years. So now we're approaching, and maybe we already crossed 4 million today. I just checked this like a couple days ago. But we're approaching about 4 million downloads per week on NPM. And so it's really nice to see like how people start adopting it and using it even outside Angular. So to introduce myself quickly, My name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm the Senior Director of Developer Experience right now at NX. These are some of my social handles. I'm also Google Developer Expert for Angular, already I think 4 years now, so time flies, 4 or 5 years. And I'm also an instructor at egghead.io where I publish courses. If you want to learn about NX, you might also see me on the YouTube channel there. So I also get paid for making weird faces on thumbnails, so it's interesting. And I'm actually not living quite far away, like as was said like in the intro, I'm from Bolzano, about 2 hours drive away. I'm Italian, I'm living there, I grew up there, kind of got stuck in that region. Verona actually I come by very often, like not as much in the city, but to jump off to other places from the local airport here because it's quite convenient. But today I want to talk about enterprise development for Angular using NX. So why enterprise? Well, first of all, I think we're an Angular conference here, so we know Angular is really strong in our enterprise environment. So a lot of financial institutions, banks use Angular on really large-scale applications because it has some cool and opinionated also kind of blocks and roadblocks in a way, which like allow you to kind of guardrails, say, which allow you to kind of build productively also with larger teams. And as part of our consulting work at NX, we work with some quite big companies. These are some of them, where we kind of help them scale up their application environment with Angular, but also outside of Angular. And NX was actually just a 20% project that we did on our Fridays, right? So we worked with them during the week, and on Fridays we kind of invested time to kind of fix some of the pains that we encountered while working with these companies. I think that's a good point because then you can experience like what is wrong, and like we try to implement it in NX and then reuse NX next week at that client to kind of help ourselves, but also help hopefully them. And so that's what I wanted to arrive at a bit today. So what are some of these common pain points that companies often can encounter in development in general, like when they build Angular applications? And some of them basically go from scalability, maintainability, customizability, automation, and maybe also diversification. And they blur into each other, right? So a scalable application, you might want to scale, but then it also needs to be maintainable. So the lines between those are a bit fuzzy. So with scaling, I don't intend, just to be clear, I don't intend runtime scaling, right? So different service clusters, dynamic spin-offs, whatever, but actually development time scaling. So how do you scale your code base such that it is sustainable? How do you scale your team? Because what often happens is you start building your application, it gets bigger, and more people join, right? And so at some point you get some local teams within the same app. And so you need to kind of figure out like, how do we make sure that scales actually? And then clearly the CI. Because as our application gets bigger, CI time will go from 5 minutes, 10 minutes to half an hour, then it becomes problematic. So we need to also take that into account. So just to quickly show you on an actual code, and I guess I switch to light mode. I always start with dark mode so people know I'm actually using dark mode for development. But so this here is an Angular workspace generated with NX, right? So I didn't use the Angular CLI to create this, but actually I used NX to create this. But if you look at it, the structure is actually pretty familiar, right? So we have a source folder, we have an app folder, usual stuff inside here, some of the things that we have seen today in the first talk, right? App config, app routes. So this is a new Angular application created with NX. And it's a single project workspace. We also call it standalone projects, but we figured with Angular that's kind of difficult because like there's standalone APIs. So people were like, what does that mean? Is that with standalone APIs? Yeah, it is with standalone APIs, but it doesn't have to necessarily do with anything with that, right? So it's just a single project setup, not a monorepo. So start simple and go from there. There are some differences clearly. So if you look a bit closer, we have an end-to-end folder, which in the Angular CLI you don't have initially. So here I opted for Cypress end-to-end test. You can also use Playwright. There's also some initial setup already for ESLint, for Prettier, for Jest, because those have been some tools which we have seen working with these companies actually pretty valuable. So you almost always want to have those at some point. So that's why we set them up initially when you create the workspace. There's an NX JSON here, which is metadata for NX to configure caching and some other stuff. We can ignore that for now. Another thing you might be missing here is there's no Angular JSON, right? So what you see here instead is there's a project JSON, and the reason is NX at some point we started diverging a bit from that because we saw when your application grows and you have multiple projects in an Angular workspace, which you can also have with Angular CLI, that single Angular JSON often became a problem because of merge conflicts. You have one single gigantic configuration where everyone tries to merge in. And so at some point we kind of extracted that and created one project JSON per project you might have. Now here we just have one project, so there's just one project JSON, but it could potentially be more. If you look into it, the structure is very similar though, right? So instead of like an architect part here, we have targets. Instead of here builder, we call it executor. But in the end, if you look at the actual builder, it's the one from the Angular dev kit, right? So this allows you to just switch this out with the new ES build one or the Vite one for the development server. There is also some NX specific builders that we have, but those are usually for very specific use case. So for instance, if you want to create a module federation setup with Angular, this would be the builder that you would be using. But there will be a generator that kind of takes care of that for you. So you don't have to really worry about that. Now, if we want to run this, so we just do nx build, right, instead of ng build. So that's the main difference. The command, how you invoke it, is very similar again, right? So you don't notice a lot of differences there. You can also do something like run many, run me all the build, lint test for this workspace, and nx here would dynamically in parallel schedule these tasks and run them. One big difference that you see right away, and we will talk about it a bit later, is if you run this again, it's super fast, right? It didn't even run, it looks like, but like you have the output there, you have the files restored, and this is the so-called caching that we do, which helps us scaling as well. So why am I showing you this? Because one aspect of scaling, as I mentioned before, is how do you structure your code, right? And so very often what you do at some point, you start here, right? And you might start creating folders. Some created in the source folder directly, some here inside the app folder. But you might have something like the orders. You might create something like products, right? And you have like shared and UI and whatnot. You create these folders inside there, and they start to grow, right? And at some point they get bigger, and some teams might be allocated to one of these single folders. Some might allocate to others. But having just a folder structure might become difficult. Also, you have just always one app, so you're always just building that single big block, right, which kind of becomes monolithic over time. And so one thing that we kind of promote on the NX side is to actually extract these into local projects. I don't even want to call them libraries. They're technically are libraries, but we don't want to create something that is shareable with the outside world. We just want to have it for the structuring purpose here inside our workspace. And so, for instance, what we can do is I can generate, so there are also generators, of course. Say I want to generate an Angular lib. Let's call this products. And the directory I want to have this is, let's call them modules, or we could call it features. And I want to have it in the module/products something. Right? And so this creates me here a new folder with a products library in here. And so same, I could do orders, just to have some more here. Right, so create the same there. And maybe we have also something like shared UI. And I want to even, let's say like our UI components or something that we have direct in there. And so now you can see I start building up a structure, which is just another folder within my single project workspace, which has like sub-projects if you want, right? So this has its own source folder. It has an index.ts file where I export stuff and share it with others. So this is my public API to some degree. It already gives me more structure in the sense I can say, hey, what inside that folder, in that lib folder here, remains within my project? What do I want to expose and share with others? So if I want to expose it, well, I'm going to go and share it here in index.ts, so export it there again. Right? And so you can start structuring this. If you have, by the way, big pro tip, if you have NX console installed, you can also show the graph of how this looks like. And right now, it's just our ng single, which is our application, and we have now these three other projects that we just created. And then you start just using them in your project. So what happened when I generated these is also in a tsconfig down here, it created me these TypeScript path mappings. So this is a feature from TypeScript that allows you to create aliases. So you say whenever you see this one here, you're actually going to import this file. So this is the entry point file. And so, for instance, if I go to the app component, let's go there, it's the easiest probably, and I just go and say import orders component, right? So I would, Visual Studio didn't help me quite a lot there, ng single orders, right? And they would import the same from products, right? And maybe I'm going to reference them directly here. You should probably do lazy loading, but it works for this demo, I guess. And so if I show the graph again, now you can see it starts reflecting these changes in the sense that I have now this connection between these apps, right? And so again, now we have one application, nothing changed in terms of the actual deployment. So we always deploy the same application, it gets built into the main app, and we can kind of, with this approach, kind of start developing. But we have already one advantage that now my orders team can just work on this orders project, right? And so they just run the test for orders, right? Or just for product. So they can start just working within that. And this can become as complex as you want. So it can be just one project, it can be a folder with subfolders for order list and various features that you might be implementing. And you see this scales really well if your application gets bigger. So the whole point here is like what NX tries to do is like you have your framework at the top, which is Angular, and it provides you a series of tools that help you work more efficiently. To clearly TypeScript, Cypress Playwright, Jest, ESBuild. Now Angular luckily also jumped on the whole ESBuild and vtrain, which we had in the React setup for NX, which is super beneficial because it's just so much better to work with, right? So I hope they push that forward. And then you kind of start structuring and modularizing your application basically with these kind of local libraries, which you then connect over time. And maybe at some point you start even going ahead and creating a second application. And now we start having a monorepo, right? Because maybe it outgrows and you start saying, well, this is like our application actually could be sliced into a public facing one, which is our website, right? Where customers join in, see our products. And then there's more the operational side of the application where third-party vendors come in our online shop and kind of add new products, delete products, and manage those type of things. So you could start splitting those up, and now then effectively you have a monorepo, you can deploy these independently. So for instance, you might want to use analog.js, which is actually using NX even under the hood for its own libraries, for the front-facing part because it can be statically generated, it's much more efficient, right? And then for the rest of it, just use Angular. It can also be an interesting scenario for an incremental migration. So just part of it migrates to analog, the rest of it remains, right? So what you do literally is just reshuffle those libraries that you have built and import them in different locations in these applications. Or go even further, have a backend in the same repo, a Node.js backend, Java.NET backend, and share some stuff between those. Most interestingly, usually what happens is like sharing types of the APIs. So you have your API exposing some types, you can reuse them on the front end and just integrate and have type safety across the stack, basically. So really what we try to do is kind of help grow with NX, where you start small with a single project, then you go to a monorepo, you might even go and split up your application, slice it in a module federation, micro front-end thing. Like it really depends on the complexity you need, right? So you shouldn't be going for full thing right immediately, but if you need to, you should be able to expand easily, right? So that's the whole goal that we are trying to achieve. Like for instance, in our application here, let me actually just commit this real quick. What if we want to migrate to a monorepo, right? So we have this situation here, we have this single workspace. Now I come at the point where I'm like, oh, actually I would need now a second app, I would need a monorepo. So there's actually a generator that says convert to monorepo, which you can click, and this is just a command, right, which uses run, so we could also do it on a terminal, you can see here. And what it does, it is converts your application into a monorepo. So now we have an apps folder with our app inside. Our libs folder moved down here. You could even structure it more so that such that these are specific to maybe just this application, right? So nested. But now we have a monorepo. So we grew from a single app into a monorepo, and now we can add a second app and go from there, right? So it allows us to have that flexibility to keep going as we need it or as we start growing bigger. Now comes the question that I anticipated initially. So now as we have more projects, what will inevitably happen, as you all know, is like CI times will go up, because now I'm not building and testing a single project, but I'm building and testing multiple projects, right? If you have a monorepo, even more so. And so up at a certain point, again, if you're a small project, if the build takes like 15 minutes, who cares, right? It's on CI, I can do other stuff in between, done. But after like 30 minutes, it starts to become a problem. And that's when it starts leading to congestion. So what happened is we use a monorepo and accelerate the development because we can easily share stuff and work together. But then once we submit that PR, it blows up. And so what people start doing is they create PRs like that. Why? Because CI is slow. So I don't want to create multiple small PRs. I create one big one, stuff everything inside. So I just have to go through the tests once, right? So hopefully go through and I'm done. But these are not reviewable, right? Like 200 files is not something someone is going to look at, so the quality degrades again. So clearly what we want to have is something like this. So it will go upwards inevitably. So that's physics, right? But like we want to keep that as like flatten the curve. You all know how that works, right? By now. So that's what I call layers of speed. Layers because you can go up this as far as you need it. So you might just start here, that's fine, I have a small project. At some point I need some more prioritization. I might also need some more like logic of just running tasks for those projects I actually touched. And I keep going upwards. So I don't need to go full in here again, right? It's just I add it as I need it over time. So what are some of these? Fast tooling, we've heard about it before. Projector doesn't like fast tooling. So we heard about before, Angular is now looking into ES-Build. Other frameworks have done that before, like ES-Build, Vite, RSpec is another one that is out there, Vitest for testing. So Angular is now moving in that direction as well, which is really cool because the tooling underneath is really the starting point, right? You cannot really get faster than that. That's your starting point you get to go with. And then on top of it, there comes more things, right? So intelligent parallelization. So what we can do in an X, for instance, instead of doing this, we do something like this, right? So we run everything in parallel, but knowing the dependencies between those tasks. So you can see here there's one block that is further on the right. So why didn't it like go in the first line? Well, because this task depends on the output of another task. So Next knows that and kind of reschedules that in a way where these work, right? And they're parallelized as much as possible. And how does it work? Well, because of this graph. I've shown it to you before. And this is the graph that NX builds behind the scenes, which you can also visualize. But NX also uses that behind the scenes to understand how the dependencies work. So if something like this changes, it knows that it needs to build those down-level projects as well, for instance, right? And so that's how it figures out the dependencies. And this graph also allows you on CI to say, oh, I don't want to run all the projects and test all the projects. I just want to test those that got changed, right? And so that's what we call affected. And so what happens there is if we change a project here in between, we know that we need to test all the projects upwards, because they are affected. All the other nodes we didn't touch, so nothing should happen there, right? And so that's how we can already start getting faster, because we just build a subset of it and not like everything every time. Again, if you need it. If you have a small project, running everything every time might totally work. Then there's the caching that I've shown just before. So we just basically, it's a memoization, but at a process level, right? So we check there's inputs, environment files, and then we build the hash out of it. And if you run it next time and the hash doesn't change, we just pick it out of the cache, which then restores basically the logs for you, the artifacts that might be created like CSS and these JavaScript files, and restores them to the folder. So from your perspective, it seems like you ran it. It's just really, really faster. And so again, like an example before, if we have these affected commands and we run this, we push it up to our like CI environment, what might happen is, well, this project here in between fails. So we have to rerun everything again. Well, if we have caching in place, we just need to run the upper two, right? Because the other one didn't change, right? We fixed the test, the upper two now need to rerun, so the second run is already faster than the first run, right? So this is how you can incrementally kind of adjust this. Now, one thing I want to talk about, and also because we're currently working on some cool features about distribution on CI, which means basically distributing computation not just on a single machine in parallel, but across multiple machines. Because in the worst case, if you change something in your project that's huge, right? I'm talking about 100, 200, 300 projects in a workspace, and you change some node down there at the very bottom, right? Like our UI components. Oh my God, some change. Everything is affected. Everything needs to rerun. The whole thing like takes again 2 hours, right? And so what we started doing is we create more intelligent CI. So CI that can actually grab into the project graph, take that knowledge, and then start distributing that in an intelligent fashion, but not on a single machine. So you run again the annex affected, something like that. You get these different tasks out of it. The CI, in this case, is able to split them up into even smaller tasks because it knows all the different projects. And knowing how they depend on each other, it can start spreading them out into different machines, right? And the cool thing is, first of all, it benefits from the caching, which is not super visible here on this one. It benefits from the cache, the remote cache that is in a sender, so it can reuse previous run commands. But also, if you run out of this, so 3 machines are not enough, Well, we can add another one, and it would automatically rebalance the whole task on 4 machines now, without you having to change the actual CI configuration. And this becomes really powerful, because now you have like a generic description of CI, basically, that gets translated in an actual distribution around multiple agents. So how do you enable that? Well, instead of just doing this, we have already on our docs a couple of different examples where basically you can enable that with this is a GitHub Actions example, but you can see here at the bottom, you define the agents. So in this case, 3 agents. It uses a template for GitHub. And then up here, you just basically run the command to actually record the whole formatting stuff, and then you just run the actual command. And having this here and this here, it allows you to distribute that across different agents. So it's actually not a lot of stuff to write. There is more guides that we have for the various providers. So these are the ones that we have right now documented on our docs, depending on which one you're using. But we want to make this even simpler. And so we're currently working on a feature which will be released probably in February, which allows you to just do this. Right? So you don't have to have all that other stuff. You just have to effect the command and say distribute this on 8 Linux medium machines, which is a specification based on RAM and whatnot that you can define, right? And it would automatically spin those up based on how they are needed. So maybe just 2 of them are needed, so it would just use 2 of them. But it's completely dynamic. Cool. So now we have big workspace. We have optimized our CI. But what about the whole maintainability story? We haven't talked a lot about that, right? Now we have all these projects. They can depend on each other, so we get like potentially a mess out of it. So as I mentioned initially, like the structure of your workspace can become arbitrarily complex. You can just have one project. What many do is like they split it even up by applications and then have different type of libraries. For instance, you have feature type of libraries which represent a use case flow, like a checkout process, for instance, on your shop when someone clicks add to cart. You have different UI component libraries that are specific to a use case. So let's say here, for instance, we have our orders. So you will have order-specific UI components that probably compose together from the general purpose design system components, but you have the checkout button that has already some logic in it, right? So these are specific to the order process. And then you have some usually more domain logic libraries, which are general purpose TypeScript libraries that handle backend communication, that type of stuff. And so in the workspace level, it could look like this, right? So you have your orders folder and you have these different sub-projects inside there. But how do we prevent that someone, for instance, goes and from the domain layer just import some feature type of library? Maybe it's just a kind of function or something, right? Well, we want to definitely prevent that, right? Because that's like a different direction. Actually, we would probably want the other direction around. And so, or even across domain areas, right? So grabbing some UI component from the orders. Because this is probably what we want to have, right? So we want to have where feature depends on its own UI libraries, which then assembles different lower level design component systems. And what we did there is we developed basically an approach or a feature set which allows you to kind of define rules that define which type of project can depend on which other type of project and which kind of domain area or scope can depend on which other scope, right? And types, again, as I mentioned, are feature, UI, business logic. Scope is the domain. Is it about orders? Is it about products? Is it about shared components, shared logic? And then what you can do is you tag the project, like you clearly need to tell NX in this case, hey, this belongs to scope orders because it's my order library, my order project, and it's of type UI because it has UI components. And then you can define lint rules. So in a descriptive way where you say the source tag of type domain can only depend on type util, for instance. Clearly the feature one at the very top can depend on most stuff because that's intended. But if you look at the util type at the very top bottom, it can just depend on other utility libraries. We don't want to have that grab further up libraries, right? And similarly with the domain. So you can kind of have these boundaries around your code. Since these are lint rules, it's cool because like whenever you import it, it doesn't match a rule, it would pop up in your editor. You would see the quickly lines underneath that tell you, hey, this is not allowed. And at the same time, you can also run it on CI clearly, such that your PR fails, right? If you kind of don't match that. And so it's about the generator part. The maintainability part is not just like setting boundaries, but also looking at potential automation, right? So the generators we already have. We have automated updates that are present also in NX. So you can similarly run ng update in Angular. You can run nx migrate in NX. It would also migrate your Angular application. But one thing that on a bigger scale you also need is automate your setup, right? Automate your customization, your specific use case. Let's say the tags that we have seen before, you might have very specific tags in your own workspace. So you might want that your NX generate library is in a very specific setup that works for you, adding already the tags, adding some imports, adding rules, specific lint rules that you might have in your company. And so what we did there is like it allows you to create plugins. Now plugins can be shared. Actually, we have quite a lot of community plugins that are shared in the open. They're just NPM libraries. But you can also just implement them in your workspace. To just generate such a plugin in your workspace, and then you can directly invoke those generators that you built as you would do others. And also NX Console would pick them up automatically. And this is a powerful way which a lot of bigger companies do to guarantee consistency, which is part also of the maintainability approach, right? So such that every new person that joins our team doesn't have to learn the docs and whatever. It just runs a generator to create a new setup of a new library, new component or whatnot, right? So you can kind of tailor how that should look like such that even new projects are consistent with your setup. There's a video here, which is linked here below, which kind of goes into these details. Now, this is not on an Angular project, it's just on a general purpose monorepo, but the project setup works exactly the same. So just kind of work through what this looks like. I've also given a talk this year at ngconf in June, I believe, which should be out on their YouTube channel in a bit, I guess. So have an eye on that, because that is exactly talking just about that, how you can customize your Angular workspace experience using such custom generators. Now, one question you might have is, cool, this is nice, but I don't have a greenfield project. I'm not using an X right now, so can I migrate? Is it easy? What's the experience there? So to migrate, all you need to do, and like this is in quotes, because it depends on your setup, clearly, but like in a normal setup, all you need to do is this, like NX at latest init, and NX will figure out, okay, this is like an Angular workspace, so it runs a specific migration to convert it to an NX workspace. And so if we look, for instance, at, let me see. I'll be quick, I promise. So we have here our new NG app, which is an Angular application, Angular CLI app, right? And so what I can do here is if I run mpx nx at latest init, it asks me here, like what are the builds that I want, like what are tasks that I want to cache? It already pre-selects build and test, so this looks good to me. Do I want to activate remote caching? I could, I don't need right now. And then it installs basically the dependencies it might need. Let's see. Phone tethering, please work. All right, and then it runs the actual conversation and like the conversion. And what you see then is you have the new workspace. You have now a project JSON, you have an NX JSON, so this is now an NX workspace, right? And you can also migrate directly to a monorepo if you want to. Is it compatible with the Angular dev kit? So if I have an NX workspace, the next question is often like, yeah, but can I still use the schematics from that third-party library, which are pretty useful, right? And you totally can, right? So you can just run them the same way. NX has a compatibility layer, which it will automatically translate it to like an Angular JSON. So if that schematic expects a single Angular JSON, at runtime it will find that in memory, right? And then it will be able to operate just normally. So wrapping up, we talked a bit about these different concepts, scaling, how you can distribute different libraries on CI, caching, these type of things, to layers of speed. Customizability, how you can potentially create a plugin to automate it. I didn't go into the specifics because that would be another talk. But if you want to learn more, we have also a page on our docs that kind of compares specifically the two things. So we're showing up the similarities between Angular CLI and NX CLI, and also showing like what NX can do more and where there's like additional stuff that you could potentially leverage in your project. There's also tutorials. So we have a tutorial, like if you look up here, there's like a tutorial for Angular standalone applications, so basically single project and monorepo. With a video guide as well, so you can kind of follow on the tutorials with a video in behind, depending on what you prefer for learning. You can also try our NX AI assistant. You obviously need to have AI nowadays, right? So it's kind of like it's very powerful because you can kind of interactively search, and it will also give you the sources to the docs pages where it kind of got that information. So you can, in case it hallucinates, you can verify yourself, which is pretty useful sometimes. So definitely check that out and let us know. There are feedback buttons to let us know how well it works. Our YouTube channel, if you want to learn more, and this is where you can get in touch with me. I would love to chat, specifically if you're not using NX right now and you kind of have questions or doubts of whether migrating would make sense. And there's our community links below here. We have a pretty big Discord community, so feel free to join there and ask questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Juri. Any question? We will take some more minutes because we started late. So any question for Juri? You again, okay.
I think I have something for everybody, so more or less. Thank you so much for the talk, really interesting. I'd like to know, from the CI point of view, when it said all of those things of for optimization of caching and everything, so taking down the pipeline times.
Yep.
I saw a layer that was actually NX Cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to know if we can have that kind of setup and that kind of advantages, but plugging in some on-premise installation of Jenkins or whatever. So, so that I'm not actually, let me say, forced to use all of the cloud products.
So, so there are two things there. So I probably didn't even like highlight that specifically. Like NX Cloud is the commercial part, right? So you can like sign up for free and you get like a certain amount of credits per month or so, and then they reset. We have on-prem installations because especially bigger enterprises want to have it locally installed and not on the cloud. So that's totally possible. And the whole distribution features are NX Cloud specific. So whenever you want to distribute between different agents and stuff, that's where you need an NX Cloud subscription. Now you could, and that's what we also did before we had that feature basically, you could do it also manually. So what people often do is like, hey, I distribute manually on a CI, I use the affected command and the caching, which is built into NX, so it's not NX Cloud specific. And then I just parallelize based on like projects or tests, like target types, like so test, build, and linting, and or end-to-end in specific ones, right? But it's a manual process. And so that's what we did usually to optimize before the distribution was as a feature available. The downside of that is that it's more static, right? Because as your test takes more time, you might need to go and change it again, right? How the distribution works, because if you just distribute by type or project, it might be suboptimal. Because what you end up with is you have like 4 machines, but the second machine has all the tests, which takes the longest, or the end-to-end test, right? So the whole CI flow needs to wait for that second machine to finish. Right. And so that distribution is actually the key that NX Cloud helps you, right? Because it dynamically redistributes it, also based on previous runs. So it knows end-to-end tests took longer, so it reshuffles them next time. So it also uses historical data. But to your question, yeah, on-premise exists, but if you want advanced feature, like advanced distribution, that's an NX Cloud subscription. But you can clearly just manually kind of split it up.
But anyways, it's above the level of the monorepo.
Yeah.
So I can still have a monorepo for myself and my own CI.
Absolutely, yeah. Pipeline. This feature integrates into your existing CI, right? So right now, it's just on top of your Jenkins.
All right.
Tomorrow, kind of hint in the future, it might be its own CI. Spoiler. It might even go in its own CI. But it will always have both options, because some people just want to keep going with Jenkins, let's say, or GitLab or whatever.
All right. Yep. Thank you very much.
No more questions? Okay, maybe one last one. No. But we haven't any question. One question. No, we haven't questions. So
everyone is happy. By the way, I have stickers down here, so grab them afterwards. I don't want to take them home.
Okay. Thank you, Juri. A big round of applause for Juri.
Thank you.